forgotten. Maybe your memory is similar to mine. Walking home from grade school, a few pennies in my pocket, going and stopping at that corner grocery store that maybe I was told I shouldn't stop at on the way home, looking in the candy counter and trying to decide what am I going to buy with those few pennies. My memory is not of a grocery store here in Kearney, it's of Grunwald's in Hastings at 9th and Kansas because that's where I grew up. But perhaps your memory is of a store named Reddy's, Cottage Circle, maybe Baines or Swain's, or maybe a store in your own hometown. Unfortunately, many of the younger generations have no clue that these stores even existed, let alone the importance that they were to their local neighborhoods. I was kind of surprised when I was doing my research that I found out that many of these stores were called suburban grocery stores in the literature, and I suppose because they were in the suburbs in Kearney, they were just in our local neighborhoods. They might have been called the mom and pop store, the corner grocery store, the shop on the corner. So where were these stores in Kearney? Well, if you drive around Kearney and you see a parking lot, an empty space, especially by an alley, there might have been a neighborhood grocery store at that location. So today I'm going to tell you where those grocery stores were in Kearney and a little bit about the people that ran those stores. I'm anxious to hear your questions and some of your stories afterwards as well. So the first grocery store in Kearney was established around 1920. So this article in the Hub says that Mr. J.D. Saunders is going to open the first suburban grocery store in Kearney. He is hiring a gentleman by the name of Frank Coover, who is a carpenter in town, to build his store, and the Hub says that everybody's going to be watching the store to see if it's a success, as it has been successful in other communities. So they complete the store and open it early in probably 1920 or 1921, and it's called the Clubhouse Grocery at 821 West Lincoln Way, and it is by the college. As you can see, the college the big building right behind that telephone pole. I don't know the date on this picture. It looks like it's in the winter though. So he built his grocery store here, but by 1922 he was expanding already because he was having a lot of success, and he also built a cafeteria on one end and a barber shop on the other end of his store. So J.D. Saunders was a gentleman who came to Kearney in 1892 from North Carolina. Some of the family writings indicate that he came and he worked for the Franks, first in their carriage house, and then most likely learned his trade as an electrician with them. Because in 1908 we know that he was the chief electrician at the Kearney Electric Powerhouse. However, in 1908, he is resigning that position because he is going to be the head of the normal school dormitory. It was fairly new, the college was fairly new at the time. His wife was the chief cook, and so they ran the dormitory before he opened his grocery store. His wife Tilly and J.D. Raised 11 children in Kearney. Unfortunately, they lost one of their children at the age of 14 when he was killed in a motor vehicle accident. He was a Boy Scout, and they were coming home from an event and was killed on the west side of town. So J.D. and his wife Tilly ran this store for about 14 years, and then in 1934 he decided to sell the store, and the Frederickson brothers, who were from Minnesota, bought the store. However, they only ran it for about a year, and then a Mr. Sam Klein is known to be buying the store in 1935 in January. However, by September he is selling the store to the O.P. Skaggs Corporation. So O.P. Skaggs already had a grocery store downtown at this time, but they opened up at this location and ran the store here for about 5 years. The 1941 city directory has it vacant. We are missing some directories. They weren't published every year, so we don't know exactly when they closed. But by 1947, there is another grocery store here called the 9th Avenue Grocery Store. It's run by L.L. Hendricks, who is another grocer with stores downtown later in Kearney history. So after he closed the store in 1935, or he sold it in 34, but the store was closed, and he moved to California. His wife had died in 1937 here in Kearney. Apparently he had family out in California, and he also had a fruit farm out there. It indicated that he often would ship fruit from the West Coast to Kearney here, and then he would sell it at his store. He did come back to Kearney area before he died, a couple years. He died in 1955, and he is buried in the Kearney Cemetery with many of his children and family. He did do a little advertising, and he really catered toward the students. He hired a lot of students to work in his store. He indicates that he has anything you would need for school supplies. He has anything you would need for lunches and picnics, and you could go to his cafeteria and get the best and the cheapest food. The store location today is a parking lot for the Board of Regents by the college, which the scenery has changed a little bit. I go the right way? So people were looking, and obviously his store was successful. So by 1924, there were 10 suburban grocery stores in Kearney. They were most likely successful partly because many women didn't drive at that time, and so they couldn't go to the store during the day when their husbands were at work. But they could send that child down to the corner grocery store with a list, and most likely when they walked in that store, that grocer knew who they were and filled their order and sent them home with their groceries. Probably just put it on credit. They didn't even have to send money with the child. So they continued to be popular. By 1930, over half the grocery stores in Kearney were neighborhood grocery stores. So at that time, there were 14 out of the 26 stores, and the peak of it was in 1941 when we had 20 at one time, 20 neighborhood grocery stores at that time, out of the 35 stores that were in the town. As times changed, we know that by 1970, there were only 2 suburban grocery stores left in Kearney. Does anybody have an idea what those might be? Reddy's. And Cottage Circle.
Oh.
Those were the 2 latest ones. Very good. I wanted to show you a little bit. This is just a map of where all those stores were located, not at any one point of time, but throughout the years. You can see the big kind of opening in the middle where Central Avenue is and where all the downtown grocery stores were. Of course, the thing I remember most is the candy. That was the most important thing. So I put some of my favorites and maybe your favorites. I guess I really liked the candy necklace. That was pretty cool. You could put it on and walk home and eat as you walked home. The candy cigarettes were terrible. You were kind of cool, but they tasted terrible, as a lot of this penny candy did. If you don't see yours here, you may see it on this next slide. I do want to mention the bazooka gum. I did bring you all some bazooka gum today, which I will give you later. I always like to read the comics in it, but I realized after getting it that you want to save your wrapper after about 3 or 4 minutes. You want to be done with the gum. There's no taste left. And yeah, if you were sitting at the tables, I was going to tell you, do not put it under your chair or on the table. Some of the other candy here is, oh, I better go on this one too. The Bit-O Honey, the Chiclets, the wax lips were pretty cool. I like the Sixlets because they were chocolate. The Jawbreakers were always a big hit as well. So this grocery store we're going to talk about is really the inspiration for my project. I knew that my aunt and uncle, Don and Ines Carson, ran a grocery store at the corner of 18th and F. I was too little to remember this, so that's what started me on my research. I didn't even know what the name of it was, so I asked Elaine, and we figured out it was called First Ward, and then she said, well, that would be a good project for you to work on. Hence my talk today. So this store was one of those early 10 grocery stores. It was started in 1924, and at that time it was known as Brundage and Lloyd. So Mr. Brundage soon got himself in some hot water with the law, and Mr. Lloyd bought him out after a couple years. Mr. Lloyd continued to run it, and then my aunt and uncle bought the store from Agnes Moffat, who was Mr. Lloyd's daughter. They were some longtime grocers in town. They ran this store for 25 years. They lived in the front of the store, and when they first started, there was only 2 rooms behind there, but they eventually had 4 children and had to add on several rooms in the back of the store. My cousin Donna, who's up in this picture with that handsome gentleman who's my dad, she gave me a lot of good information because she said she started helping at the store when she was 10 years old. And that her mom's best advice to her was just treat the customer as you would want to be treated, which was the motto for running their store. She said they got their eggs, like most of the grocery stores, from local farmers. They had a few up north that they bought from. They used Brown's Wholesale. There was several different wholesales, but in the later years, it was Brown's. And she remembers that Mr. Brown would come down to the store and open the cooler and take out a Coke and sit down with her dad and just shoot the breeze. I think a lot of the grocers knew each other back then, and they knew their wholesale people, and they were all good friends. She also said they used the Fairmont Dairy for their dairy products and Divas for their bread. She said at one time she thinks she even remembers there was a gas pump in front of the store. I guess a few of them would sell gas at times. And a lot of people put their groceries on credit. And when she closed, there was several accounts that were never paid. So in 1961, they decided they just really couldn't make ends meet anymore and continue to raise their family on their grocery store business. So they closed the store. Ines went on to work for Geist Groceries and also George's Market. She was also very involved in the Bryant PTO and the VFW. Don went on to work at the college. He was also a volunteer firefighter in Kearney for over 25 years. And he did die early in the 60s, but Ines lived a long life to the age of 91 and died in 2008, and they are buried in the Kearney Cemetery. So somebody wondered why I did this project. That's why. But it was really fun as I got going. So this is Don and Ines and their daughter Donna in the late 1940s. So I did ask her, why did you call it First Word Grocery? Well, she was explaining to me that in Kearney there were 4 wards, and so they were located in the 1st ward, and this store was located in the 2nd ward. So this grocery store is one of the early grocery stores. You can't tell from this picture, but it is across the way from Kenwood, and thus the name Kenwood. So this little house on the corner here, that is not the store. That house faces 5th Avenue, and all the grocers that worked at that store lived in that house. The grocery store was actually around the corner. Do you see the alley and the empty spot? That is where the grocery store was, facing 16th Street. So this grocer opened in 1924, and his name was Adalbert Kaiser. He ran the store for about 12 years, and then he died in 1935. And his daughter Ethel, who'd probably been working in the store some, she took over and ran it for another 6 or 7 years. Then the war came along and they closed the store during the war. After the war, Ethel's son came back and he reopened the store and ran it for another 14 years. He did have a couple other grocers in there at the time, a Mr. Marshall Potter and a Leon Porter that ran the store. And they finally closed it in 1964. So about that time, a lot of the stores were starting to close. I do have someone that remembers shopping at this grocery store. This is another store that is very well known in Kearney. It was known the later years as Baines, and it is over on Avenue A, fairly close to the hospital. It was one of the early 10 grocery stores, and it was opened in 1922 by an E.R. Saunders. I couldn't find any connection with him to J.D. Saunders, but he ran it for about 14 years when a Mr. Erlinson took over. And we will hear his name over and over again with the different neighborhood grocery stores that we talk about. One of the main owners was Herbert and Doris Dietz, who bought the store in 1949. And a lot of people remember the Dietz running the store and it being there by the hospital. The best known was Mr. Harvey Beans. Harvey Beans and his family ran the store for about 13 years from 1955 until they closed in 1968. Harvey, you could see in the back of the building, their address was at this building, so I believe their family lived at the store as well. That was pretty common back then. It doesn't look very big. Several of his sons also worked in this store. It's no longer there because it burned in January of 2009. You can see this house that was near the alley too. Several of the grocers lived in the house there near the store before the Baines lived at the store. Reddy's, this is the one that everybody knows, right? This one was here the longest. It was actually a store run by the same family for 70 years in Kearney. So from 1921 to 1991, which was very unusual to be open for that long. So B.E. Reddy opened this store in 1921. They lived in, you can't really see the house that's kind of next to the store there. They lived in that house, which faces 25th Street, while they ran the store. B.E. Reddy's son John is the one that most people remember, and he started working at the store as a boy, and then he inherited the store when his dad passed away. John worked there every year except when he was gone in World War II. So John Reddy was known as the candy man in town. He said in an article too that he remembers his first customer he ever waited on was a Mrs. Well, who bought a loaf of bread, and he made sure to point out it was unsliced. That's the saying, better than sliced bread. So Mr. Reddy was a bachelor who ran the store by himself, and he really felt like the kids that came into his store were part of his family. There were many times he states in his articles that he thought about closing because once the junior high school moved up by the high school, he lost a lot of his business. He still did have a lot of kids from Central Elementary. My brother-in-law says that was the place to hang out. He went to Central Elementary, and he remembered all the kids would go to Reddy's. You'd go there at lunch, and then you'd go there after school. And he remembers giving him 5 cents to buy 5 cents worth of cheese. And I said, what do you mean? And he said he had cheese there, and then he would just slice you several pieces of cheese and put it on a paper and hand it to you. He got 3 pieces of cheese for 5 cents. I'm sure he bought candy there too. So he continued to run it, even though he said he was going to close in the 70s. He ran it till 1991, at which time he was 83 years old. So he did live another few years. He died at the age of 88, and when he passed away, his estate left $25,000 to the Kearney Public School Foundation to buy clothes and supplies for the needy kids. I saw some articles. They replenished this fund in 2010. They had a fundraiser, and so that they could continue to do that. Mr. Reddy is buried in Gibbon, Nebraska. This little cute house down on Central Avenue on 13th was only a grocery store for a couple years, for 2 years, but I wanted to include it because the gentleman, Mr. Boker, that ran this store was interesting and had some roles in the Kearney community. So Mr. Boker came to Kearney in 1903 from Ravenna, but when he first came, he didn't open his store yet. He ran for city government, and he was the clerk of the district court for at least 8 years. Then in 1911, he was very well known as the first man in Buffalo County to have an irrigation system. And then in 1912, he was very instrumental in opening the Kearney Canning Company, and he proceeded to run the canning company. The canning company, unfortunately, burned down in 1918, suspiciously. However, while he ran it, he had contracts with local farmers for corn and tomatoes. He also opened a nursery, and then he raised a lot of foodstuffs himself. Their family also opened a few other businesses, a gravel company and a dairy throughout the years. And then in 1922, he decided to open a grocery store at his house. And that was only open for 2 years for some reason. And then also his daughter, Mabel, would get into the grocery business as she later on marries a Mr. Burt Dady, who opens a grocery store later on that we'll talk about. Down the road, just a block, there is another early grocery store, and it was called the Beehive Grocery. This little store's location today is a parking lot. It is just south of the courthouse and the jail on that side, probably about where that white car is. This store was very early in the 1924 again. Interestingly, a J.C. Eldred opened this store, who in 1922 was listed as the clerk at the Boker store. So perhaps he enjoyed his job and he wanted to open his own grocery store. So he ran this store for a few years, and then Mr. Beagle took over, and he and his son ran it. There was some interesting history about them I won't go a lot into, but where one of his son-in-laws got mad at the other and killed him, and then there was all this trial business about the Beagles. In 1931, Mr. Fouch and Lancaster and Hoochin bought the store, and those first 2 grocers, they already had stores downtown that they were running at the time. So I'm not sure why they bought this store, which they only ran for a couple years. We'll talk about Mr. Lancaster a little bit later as well. There was also John Trindle that worked at this store, and he was the grandson of Sheriff Trindle, who was an early sheriff in Buffalo County. But people probably remember, and it's best well known for William and Pauline Lowenstein, or is it Lowenstein? I'm really not. Steen. Okay, for the Lowensteins. And again, they were a long-term grocer. They ran it for 25 years. So William died before they closed, and Pauline continued to run the store. And when they closed the store in 1966, Pauline was 85 years old. and she lived on till the age of 92. She was also the sister of Fred Geist, who was the mayor of Kearney at one time, and also had Geist Groceries. So there's some grocery connections there. This cute little house is over on Avenue G. It's not a house you drive by a lot. It actually had two different businesses in it. So in 1921, a Frank P. Blakely and his wife, Frona, opened a grocery store at this location. Frank had previously had a downtown grocery store where his family all lived, and about 3 or 4 of his kids also worked in the grocery store. After his first wife died, they moved to this location, and they ran the store for about 13 years. One interesting thing I thought, in 1927, they were advertising that they were the only store in Kearney to be giving out green trading stamps. I don't know if they were the S&H ones, they didn't say, but they were giving out trading stamps at that time. After they closed the store, Mr. Walter Lade bought the store. He and his wife Mabel ran it for about 6 or 7 years. And some of you may remember later on, they opened WM Ceramics at the store. So they had ran a ceramic store there for almost 21 years, first in the basement, and then they added on. They both lived long lives. Walter lived to the age of 92 and Mabel to the age of 105. Some of you may recognize this duplex at 2909 Central. It's down on near the hospital. It opened in 1924, the same year the hospital opened. A couple grocers ran it for just a couple years, and then in 1937, Joseph and Cecilia Wertman bought the building and ran the store, and they called it the Wertman's Handyman Grocery Store. And they are related to Nancy Polk. After that, the McGibbons ran it. Some people might be familiar with them. They ran it until 1958 and then moved out of town and closed the store. The last of the early grocery stores I'm going to talk about is Jones's Market. I do have some people that have told me they remember going to Jones's Market. Its location is 604 East 25th. Family Practice is in this location. Their address is 620 East 25th, so the store was just a little bit just on the side of the building in the parking lot. So this little store started in 1928. There were several grocers that just ran it briefly, a Mr. Thurston, a Mr. Clarno, and then it was briefly known as Don's Market. Some may know Don Hine. He ran several other grocery stores downtown, including H&K IGA, and he was the H in the H&K IGA. He then became an insurance salesman. And at that time, George and Dwayne Jones began running the store in 1955. I had one lady tell me that she remembers her mom sending her down to Jones with a list in her hand, and she would just hand it to the clerk and they would fill it, and then she could take her groceries home. They ran it for about 12 years and closed in 1967. At that time, they sold it to a Mr. Bob Wilson, who some of us may know. And for a year, it was Bob's Quick Shop number 2. They had number 1 up on 24th Street, and this was number 2. However, he did not keep that open long. Those buildings that were in that area were torn down, and we all know that Bob's Superstore was built about 1968 in this location. I didn't have a lot of information about hours for these grocers, although Mr. Reddy said that he was open from 8 in the morning till 7 at night, 6 days a week, and that he used to be open on Sunday. I did find this ordinance number 777 that was passed in 1934 that said grocers could not sell any groceries on Sunday. And if you did, it was a $100 fine, which was pretty steep in those days. So apparently several grocers went to the city council and said they don't want to be open on Sunday, and could you pass this ordinance? Well, they did, probably assuming that most of the grocers wanted this. They would soon find out that that was not the case, and there were only 13 happy grocers out of 42. So there was a lot of controversy for a while, and after a couple years, finally they came to an agreement in 1936 that they could be open from 8 to 10 in the morning and to 4 to 6 in the afternoon. And I don't know how long that stayed that way. I was also really impressed that of all those first 10 grocery stores that opened in the 1920s, that they stayed a grocery store and were open for like 40 years into this, earlier mid-60s, because some of the other stores didn't stay open that long. So then we come to the 1930s, which I'm kind of surprised there's new businesses starting in the early 1930s during the Depression. This particular lady, Maud Wright, she had 2 different grocery stores in town at 2 different locations, and it was very fun researching her. She had a unique life. So Maud Wright actually was born Maud Austin in Horton, Kentucky. She was married there at the age of 17 to a gentleman that was 20 years older, Frank Millhouse. He was 37. And at some point they moved to the Sumner area. They're here by 1900 census, and in the census, ironically, Frank Millhouse is a merchant grocer in Sumner. So they live there, but tragedy hits and their young daughter dies in 1904, and then her husband dies in 1907. So at some point there, she moves to Kearney. In the 1922 census, she's listed as a seamstress. In 1926, she's a dressmaker. And during this time, she also decides to get remarried 3 times. So first she marries a Mr. Brown, and then a Mr. Wright, and then, although he must not have been right. And then in 1930, her last marriage, she was 62 years old, and she married a George Foley. So we do actually have her marriage record to George Foley in our archives. However, by 1931, she is back in the city directory as Maud Wright, and she is running a grocery store. So George didn't last very long either. Yes. So she runs this grocery store on 8th Avenue and lives in the home. She runs it for about 6 years, and then she moves to this larger home on 3rd Avenue, which some of you may recognize this house as an older home in Kearney, and runs a store there for 12 years. She most likely wanted to move because the 1940 census has her living in this house, and she also has her 2 widowed sisters living there, her widowed brother, and 4 of his children. So they definitely, and perhaps some of them worked in the grocery store. So by the time she closed the store in 1950, Maud was 81 or 82 years old. So she also ran it into her later years. What else do I want to say about that? She died in 1956, and she is buried in the Sumner Cemetery with her first husband. And this is a picture I found on Find a Grave of Maud and her first husband, Frank. And I think this is on her tombstone, although I haven't been out to Sumner to see. Another store that was opened in 1930, it was initially called the Bungalow Grocery. I think that there was a development in Kearney called the Bungalow Development, and so that might have been where the name came from. There were a few grocers that ran this, but the main one that we know is Lyle Sherrod, and he ran it for 15 years from 1946 to 1961, so some people may remember him. Although during that time in the paper, there were a few times where there was an article like he sold it to a Mr. Orville Whitney in February, but by October he's reopening it as Sherrod's Groceries, so I'm not sure what all happened, but basically he ran this store for about 15 years. In 1961, he sold it to a Mr. H.L. Dutch Welch, and they ran the store for 3 years. Mr. Welch was originally president of Nielsen's Chevrolet here in town, and then he sold out to Kazire Chevrolet, which people might recognize. In 1964, they sold the store, and it became the Antelope Bookstore. You can see the sign above there, but otherwise the building looks very similar. Another interesting lady I thought in Kearney that ran a grocery store was Marjorie Fitzgerald Pickerel. She ran this grocery store on Avenue C called Pickerel's Grocery for about 22 years by herself. She had initially worked in a store downtown, but in 1938 she resigned her position there and applied to run a grocery store and a creamery at this location and had this store built. She eventually added on in 1948. In 1949 she had a break-in, but they only stole bubble gum and candy bars. So probably not a very old burglar, I would guess. She raised her young son by herself. She did live with her parents for a while. Her son Gerald graduated in 1939, so shortly after she opened her store. And he went on to be the publisher of the Elm Creek Beacon at some point. She retired in 1960 at the age of 65, and then she became a lay Carmelite. Not a Carmelite nun, but a lay Carmelite. I thought was interesting. And she lived to the age of 77 and is buried in the Kearney Cemetery. She did do a little advertising. I mean, many of the small grocery store owners didn't do much advertising. I know I saw some for Jones Market and Don's Market, But I thought her ad was cute here 2 years after she was open, the little ladies with their groceries. I also like to look at, the price of items, so you could get 20 pounds of sugar for 99 cents. I think this was probably 1940, shortly before the sugar rations from the war started. Some of you may recognize this home if you live in the Pioneer Park neighborhood, and thus it's called Pioneer Grocery. There were only 2 grocers at this location. Mr. Guy Pierce opened it in 1939. He and his wife Itha ran it for about 13 years. After her husband died, she continued to run it, and she was also 80 years old when she had a break-in. Obviously, she lived at the store, and so they broke in and confronted her. Perhaps that is why the next year, when she was 81, she sold the store. It was time. The next it was mentioned, Darlene and Ed Lewis ran this store, and many in the Kearney community remember them. They ran it for about 5 years, and then other people tell me, I think maybe this porch was open, and they said there used to be things on the porch, coolers that you could open up and get pop and ice cream. Here's an alley with an empty space, thus there was a neighborhood grocery store there. This store was opened in 1931, and there was 2 grocers, and Mr. Pearson, who previously had a broom company in Kearney. He ran the store for 16 years, so quite a while. After he died, Mr. Lancaster that we talked about bought the store in 1952, and he ran it for another 9 years. He had already run grocery stores since 1900. He started when he was 16 downtown at Haas & Son, and then he ran the Kearney Tea and Coffee House, which he closed in 1948, and then started running this store. He died in 1963 at the age of 79, 2 years after he closed the grocery store. And he actually lived at the address of the store. The previous owners lived in the blue house that was right on the corner facing, I think, 26th Street. We're getting there. Who would have guessed that at Russell's Appliance location that there had previously been a grocery store run by no other than Fred Russell? So I found that really interesting. Originally there was a house on the corner at 702 East 25th, and a Mr. Charles Golay lived there. He was well known for selling watermelons and cantaloupe at his grocery store. However, in 1948, Mr. Fred Russell decided to buy the store with his partner Elmer Smith, and they enlarged the store twice the size. And their partnership only lasted about a year, and then it was dissolved, but Fred continued to run the store. So I got this picture from Denny Russell, who was Fred Russell's son. Denny gave me a lot of good information. He said the store was not previously a house. It was a flat building with a flat roof, or a building with a flat roof. It also had a little building in the back where they had a cooler and they could hang meat and do their own meat processing. So that was pretty unusual for a small neighborhood grocery store to be able to do that. So Denny also worked at the store. He said he started at age 8. He started on a box and ran the cash register, which he said he had to crank. There was no barcodes to check out people in those days. They used glass wholesale, which is now where Kids is located. He said for dairy, they used the Bluebell Dairy, and said his dad was a good businessman. He had some agreements with the migrant farm workers who would come from Mexico, and their bosses would agree that their workers could come in and buy groceries, and at the end of the week, then the bosses would come back and pay for the groceries for the week. They also did some good business because they were on Highway 30, and Denny said they also got some good business from the Kearney Air Base. However, in 1955, it got to be a little too much to run the store by themselves, and they closed the store and sold it to a Roger Polat, who opened, Denny says, a motorcycle shop on the corner. So he tore down the store, opened a motorcycle shop, and I did see in the directory that this was called Polat's Sportsman's Hangout. That must have been the motorcycle place, huh? Okay. So ironically, years later, Ron and his son Steve Russell opened Russell Appliances at this location in 1992. Fred and his son, when they closed the store, they went on to work for Food Liner IGA for Jake Masser in town. And Fred worked there for 15 years, and then he opened Camel's Cafe. So maybe be familiar with that. I said we talk about the Daties. Bert Datey worked at a few different grocery stores, and then he opened this Daty's Eatin' Time Grocery and Cafe at this building he bought in 1942. And you can kind of tell in the back on the right was the residence. where they lived. That was on 17th Street. And they ran this store for about 18 years. A lot of his family helped him run it. And we all know Gail Dady, who went on to run Dad's Tavern for 50 years. The Davies. This little store was only a grocery store for about 7 years. It was called Snow White. It was over by, on 3rd, not too far from Harmon Park. Interesting thing is that Harry Hugo is the one that instigated this grocery store and applied to be a grocery store. And he was one of the Hugo players, if you're familiar with that, those people, the circus, I don't know if they're really circus people, but they went and performed in different places. The store closed in 1955, and then it was vacant for a while. In 1961, it was a vacuum cleaner shop, and then in 1964, it was Mr. Larry's Princess Styling Salon. Anybody remember that? Yes. And ironically, it is still a styling salon, Applause hair studio. Yep. All right, second to the last store we're going to talk about. So this store was on 27th. It was best known as Swain's. Several people have told me they think that this house at 213 was a store, but that's not the case. It was at 209. So it must be in that empty space, and it must have looked a lot like this house. So it also had a porch on it with coolers where you could go and get pop, and they also lived at the store, and so the store is on the porch and in just the front room there. It was previously run by Orville Whitney, who was at several different grocery stores in Kearney as well. And the last main grocery store we're going to talk about, most people know Cottage Grocery or Cottage Circle Grocery. So this store actually opened in 1933 and was called the Erlandson Cottage Grocery. This was kind of unique because 15 different grocers at least worked at this store over the years, from 1933 to 1971. Some of them were only there for 1 or 2 years. One of the ladies was Mrs. Powell's, and her husband was at the Kearney Air Base, and so she worked at the store while he was here, and then they moved back to their home in Minnesota after that. But really the best known grocers at this location were Arnie and Alice Terrence, and they ran the store for 16 years. Vicki Bissell says that's where you went to buy your oysters for Christmas, if you let Arnie know ahead of time. They then sold their store in 1970 to Floyd and Pat Butterfield, who only ran it for a couple years and then closed the store. There's a couple other houses and things in town that were grocery stores I wanted to just point out. This first one on the left upper was Frank Coover's grocery store, the gentleman that built the first grocery store for J.D. Saunders in the 40s. The duplex is on 5th Avenue, 1931 5th Avenue, and there were 3 different grocers at that location, including Mr. Erlandson. This little house on 27th was a grocery store briefly with 3 different grocers, and another Mr. Erlandson was there as well. The other 2 houses were grocery stores by Mr. Carnegie. Actually, the one on the right was one of the early 10 grocery stores. It opened in 1922. But it was right across from Emerson School, and he ran this store for 2 years and lived in the house. And then around the corner, in the middle picture here, this is on Avenue E, and then he ran this store while he still lived in the other house. There's also some locations where the houses aren't there, but there's buildings. This first one in Telecom, I would really like to see what that grocery store looked like on that corner, because there were 8 different grocers that worked there, and they almost all lived at the store as well. The building on the right, there were 6 grocers, and the store was actually more in the middle of the block, so just kind of like behind that building. This Hanley's Deluxe Grocery was out on the west end of town, and then it became Kearney Cabin Camp. And I remember this location as being like a college store where they sold clothing and things. But now I think it's like a cannabis store. Yeah, marijuana store or something. So we kind of talked about why these changes happened a little bit, where the bigger supermarkets came in. By 1955, over 60% of the grocery business was done in the supermarkets. And so we were starting to see that trend of stores closing. The small stores just couldn't compete for that high volume, low pricing. More people were driving. They could drive to any store they wanted to. And we all know it's hard to run a family business, whether it was a grocery store or any other type of family business for very long. So they eventually closed. So they are unfortunately all gone. They really were peaking in the 40s. 40s. Some of them, like I said in summary, they came and went. Some of the people lived at the store, some lived next door to the store, some lived nearby. Some of them we can see were in their 30s, and many of them were into their 70s or 80s, maybe as kind of a second career. Some of them were single, some were wives while their husbands worked, some were husband and wife teams, and some were families. But no matter who was running the store, we know they worked really hard and they provided a really valuable service for their neighborhood and community. Some of my resources were the Kearney City Directories, the Kearney Hub, interviews with my cousin Donna Carson and with Mr. Denny Russell. Find a Grave, Buffalo Tales article on J.D. Saunders, and my fellow historians here at Buffalo County Historical Society. So, any questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Okay.
You missed my dad's store.
Which one?
Jim Lee's Cash and Carry. It was 30th and A.
30?
My dad was in charge of all the maintenance at the base during the war.
Oh.
And when the war was over, he got a huge bonus that he bought that store. And the two-story house next door is still there, 30th and A.
30th and A.
Yeah.
Okay.
The store was, it was a laundromat for a while. It was student apartments, but he had a wonderful family grocery store there.
Well, and I'm glad you said that because I know I missed a few because there's only city directories for certain years, and so if they weren't in the city directory, I didn't know they existed. So I do want to get that information from you. So
My dad's biggest problem was he wouldn't make people pay their bill.
yes, yes.
He just couldn't bring himself to make
Right,
them pay their bill.
right, yeah. I think there are a lot of counts that
He
went
would
unpaid.
accept anything that you bring him to.
Really?
One man brought him a Las Vegas gambling machine, slot machine, and,
Did he put that in the store?
oh yes.
Yes.
So how about
I
George's
he would
Market?
give us kids nickels, and we loved going out there and putting nickels in, see if we could win something from his
Sure.
Las Vegas machine.
How fun. George's Market was really considered a downtown grocery store, so at some point I may do the downtown grocery store research as well. So that'd be fun. Any other questions, stories? Yes?
I have a question.
Okay.
So, these are houses now, were they built as houses or as stores or just depends?
It depends. Some of them were built as, like Bungalow was built just as a store, but a lot of them were houses first, and people lived in them, and then they opened the store. So there was a real variety of that. Yes?
So when you talked about the Russell grocery,
Yes.
and you mentioned the Mexican migrant workers, what
Yes.
era was that in? Do you know?
They ran the store from 1948 to 1955. So I don't know what part of that time, but yeah, during that time.
Cool.
Mr. Russell was originally, he had a Safeway store in North Platte, and he also had a grocery store in Ravenna before he moved his family to Kearney after the war. So,
Thanks.
Corinne.
Oh, my husband used to stay with his Aunt Mary Wallace on 8th Avenue.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, and she would send him there to pick up a loaf of bread or something. And he said they had way better bread than his dad had in his grocery store in Pleasant.
Oh, wow.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I wondered if that was the one on 2612 8th Avenue.
I wondered too, Sharon's.
He said
Yeah.
it wasn't very far from her house.
Yeah, I bet it was. If it was on 8th, for sure. That was the only one there on 8th, and then there was that one down on, that Maud Wright had
And then
down
I
there
was
too.
gonna say the Lewis grocery store, that was
Yes.
my good friend Darlene, and then.
Yeah, and a family member's here.
She worked at Redmond Shoe Store
Yes.
forever.
Yes.
And they
She
never
was
forgot
my-
it. He was very sad.
She
Grandpa
worked-
Bud?
Because he became a cop.
All right. Yeah, see, these are the stories I like to hear, and I'll add them to my files.
Well, and then Darlene's husband became a cop.
Yes, yes.
And they live just around the corner from there on 8th Avenue.
Okay.
Second house from the corner.
Yeah, it was a really fun project, and like I said, I might do the downtown ones. It'll be fun too, but we'll see. Nancy?
We lived kind of in between Swains and Cottage, but Swains had much better pin candy than I think they even had like, you could get some like jawbreakers and things that like were cheaper.
Right, right. What a deal.
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I was gonna say, I have been to Darlene and Bud's grocery store
Uh-huh.
when I was a little girl. And the thing I remembered was that huge train engine in the park.
Oh,
Now,
sure.
Now we have it here
Yes, yes.
in Pioneer Park.
Yes, I did read that train engine used to be there, yeah.
I remember scouring for glass pop bottles, because if we would take them to pieces, we could get 2 cents like a glass pop bottle.
Right,
I'm
right.
gonna trade for candy.
Good project for kids. All right, anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.